So today we are having a recap of the newly added dungeon for Mythic Plus testing, which is the Throne of the Tides. Being that this is an ancient dungeon from Cataclysm from a decade ago, it has to be updated for the modern audiences with some more extra abilities and mechanics. So we will see quite a few dangerous additions in this dungeon from both a boss perspective but also a trash mobs perspective. So in the first few pulls, your major threat is going to be interrupting the oracles because they cast Healing Wave, which it's bad. And the other one, bigger threat, is going to be the cast from the Sentinel, which is Crushing Depths. They will be using Shellbreaker, the tank buster on the tank, but what is more dangerous is the Absorb Shield, the healing Absorb Shield they will put on a particular player. As you can see here, I am just chain spamming this mage with the healing abilities I have, and I am not able to even break it before he procs his Chief Death. This was a 1.2 million absorb shield in a +20 fortified. That is what is one of the major dangers in these first trash pulls. The large amount of healing you have to do, because while the shield holds, the player will be taking 10%, I believe, of his max HP per second in damage. So you have a small window of time to break that absorb shield before the player dies. That's the number one biggest threat until you reach the last pack before picking up the teleporter to go upstairs. The last pack has the Ravager, which is big, has a lot of HP, but the danger is low. He will cast an acid barrage on the tank with a dot put on the tank, which is not that dangerous. And then the other cast, which is also quite simple to dodge, is Volatile Bolt, the big circle on the ground. You get one shot if you get hit by that, but it's quite slow. It has a quite slow cast time, so it's not that big of a danger. Once you get rid of the Ravager, you can go upstairs and go for the next corridor in this dungeon. This is quite a linear dungeon, as we will see. You don't have a lot of room to experiment different pulls in this dungeon. Here you go back having the similar threats as before. You still have the oracles casting healing waves. You still have the witches casting lightning bolts, which I'm assuming might become very dangerous at high keys. Those are the classic casts that are ignorable up to a certain level, but once you reach a certain high enough keys, they will start taking 80% HP off of your DPS players and your healer. So it's also dangerous. And then you still have the Sentinels casting the Crushing Depths healing absorb shield that you have to deal with. Once you end this corridor as well, you enter perhaps the most dangerous part of the trash mobs in the dungeon, which is the big plaza, the big circle in the middle. So this one still has the witches using lightning bolt. It still has the oracles casting the heals, but what it also has are the snapdragons. So these are the more dangerous mob in this dungeon when it comes to trash mobs. They do have two quite dangerous things. One is Razor Jaws, which is a chance when they auto-attack to apply a dot on the player, and this one can stack multiple times. And the other one is Ravenous Pursuit, which is basically a fixate, an 8 seconds long fixate. What makes this fixate quite dangerous is that number one, it's not gonna be broken or interrupted by crowd controls. If you stun, disorient, or even fear the mob, they will still continue to fixate you once the crowd control is over. The other dangerous problem is that they leap, they jump to the enemy that they want to fixate on, which means even if you try to, outsmart the fixate and stay far away, they will just start the fixate by jumping straight on you, making it much harder for you to kite around, especially as a healer who wants to, keep healing the group in a dangerous pool. While you have this guy following you for 8 seconds, it makes it quite more difficult. Those are definitely the more dangerous mobs in this dungeon, and there is going to be the most dangerous of the pools, which is the one with the 4 patrolling snapdragon. So you have to take 4 of them at once, which is going to make it, of course, dangerous the moment they start chasing a bunch of players. Also quite deadly for melees because they don't have as much time to react when they are next to them and they immediately start being fixated. And it's of course also very dangerous for the tank because the tank gets blasted by the Razor Jaws dot. It can go up to very high levels. This is a kiting angle as long as these mobs are not tuned down in the damage of this dot. But as far as trash mobs goes, this is all we have before the first boss. After this, it's just a repeat of the same mobs. You have the Sentinel with the Crushing Depths Healing Absorb, you have the Oracle with the Healing Wave to be interrupted, and the Witch with the Lightning Bolt single target nuke, as well as a Lightning Surge magic dispellable dot on player. Besides this, it's gonna be just a repeat of the same before you reach Lady Najjar, the first boss of the dungeon, which retains, you know, a similar style of the old one where she changes phases between herself and the add phase. The addition here is of quite a dangerous mechanic called Focused Tempest. It's basically a channeled set of chain lightning, so it's likely you will also have to spread as she casts that to avoid the damage from jumping to other players. In between the casts of Focus Tempest, she will do geysers that you have to spread from and avoid spawning from the ground, and then the Shock Blast. Essentially run away with the Shock Blast so that the following lightning bolts spreading from the target will be easier to dodge for the rest of the players. She will continue this rotation of the Focus Tempest damage, the Shock Blast going off into her intermission, her add phase. The add phase is made slightly more chaotic simply because you don't just have the two witches using Frostbolt and the one guard using Flurry, a cone damage in front of him. You also have a whole bunch of Murlocs running around, which makes it a bit more messy, a bit more confusing to orient yourself in the room, dodging the swirls on the ground, as well as grouping the Murlocs up. But once that's done with, you go back into her normal phase, where she will continue her rotation of the Focus Blast damage to 1 to 2 players, the Shock Blast to 1 player to spread away from the rest of the group to make it easier to dodge the balls, rinse and repeat. In classic Throne of the Tides style, right after the first boss you have the second boss, one after the other with Commander Olthok. He has a very simple pattern of abilities, which also end up being effectively a soften rage, a race against time. He is first going to do Bubbling Fissure, which is just 3 purple patches on the ground. About 10 seconds later, after having cast this fissure, he is going to do Festering Shockwave, which is going to knock all players back and give them a 10-second dot that the healer will have to heal through. Right after using this Shockwave, he will cast Awaken Ooze. So the 3 purple patches, blue patches on the ground will spawn 3 oozes that will start following players. This is quite dangerous and deceptive because it's not just 3 random adds you have to just mow down with Cleave or AoE, because these mobs have an aura, have a paddle following them around, which takes for very high damage, especially to melee players. So yes, it's also an advantage to be ranged, because you can kill them before the paddle reaches you, but if you're a melee, it's gonna be very dangerous to stay close to them. The reason why I said it's a race against time is because this pattern will repeat. The boss will spawn 3 more paddles, he will knock you back again, and then he will animate the paddles into the oozes. However, all of the previous existing paddles will also be summoning oozes. So at first you will have 3 oozes spawning, then you will have 6, then you will have 9, and then you will have 12. That's why it becomes progressively harder to get away from these adds and continue nuking the boss. The likely cheap answer to this boss is to simply use mechanics like the mass route of the druid or the mass route of the evoker and simply move the boss away and ignore the adds. That would be a simpler solution, especially if your group is melee heavy, so they would have a harder time killing these adds down. After this, you have the 2 sides leading to the last 2 bosses. The first side, going to Erunat, the mind-controlled Draenei, has basically a couple of dangers only. The Gershas, the small little mindbenders, simply do pulsating AoE, not too dangerous. The major danger is going to be the Seer and the Watcher. The Seer spawns a beam. No cast time, no warning, it just spawns a beam with an activation time of about 1.5 seconds to 2 seconds, and you have to dodge it. And then the Watcher is going to grip everyone on top of him and then blow up in an explosion a couple of seconds later, and you need to exit the circle of the Watcher to not get basically one shot. These two, the Seer and the Watcher, are basically the only two dangerous mobs before you reach the third boss. The third boss, Stormspeaker's Erunat, has been basically completely changed in its abilities, except for the flair of having a Mindbender on his head, freeing itself of the boss, and then fighting the Mindbender by himself at the end. But aside from that, the major dangers of the fight are going to be the Stormflurry Totem, which basically makes the boss do much more damage, so you want to take the totem down, although it's not nearly as dangerous of a totem as the last boss of Brackenide Hollow. Okay, it's not nearly as deadly. After that, he does do a pretty nasty Flame Shock Dot, which is dispellable, but is being cast at a faster rate of the dispel cooldown of your healer, which means more or less one in every other of these Flame Shocks will have to be tanked by the player with his own defensives and healing from the healer. The other mechanic, which is not perhaps as dangerous, is Earth Fury, which is basically a bunch of circles follow you around for 2 seconds. So you just keep running to avoid taking damage. This will repeat. He will spawn a new totem, he will keep using the flame shocks on players that you have to dispel or tank until he eventually reaches a low enough HP for the Mindbender to the boss's head to detach. At that point, the fight is basically over. It's basically roleplay. I think he disengages from his host at 20% HP. He's gonna do nothing besides one ability, Terrifying Vision, which is a 6-second fear AoE as well as a ton of damage. All you have to do is line of sight behind one of the pillars and then the boss will die. The next side of the trash, which is also the last part and also the gauntlet of the dungeon, where mobs will be respawning behind you as you have to keep going. The start is somewhat tricky. It will have some Aqua Mages spamming Aqua Blast for single target damage and Hunters spamming Throw Spear for single target damage. This Throw Spear at the moment is quite dangerous because you will end up having 4 to 5 Hunters casting Throw Spear, which might be targeting the same player. And if the same player is not the tank, you are bound to take a lot of damage. Even in a plus 20, it was 270,000 damage per spear. And you have 4 to 5 of them being cast very quickly in succession. So it's quite dangerous. However, the biggest mechanic of this gauntlet is that you're going to have a whole lot of corruptions, a whole lot of very tiny little sludges doing seemingly nothing, and then a big guy, a big elemental called Sentry. The trick here is that every time you kill one of these corruptions, you gain 1 stack of a disease debuff on you, called Wave of Corruption, which does some shadow damage and then makes you take 10% more shadow damage. And this lasts for quite a lot. It lasts for 8 seconds. As you keep killing these waves upon waves of corruption mobs, this disease will keep stacking at higher and higher level. On top of that, the big mob itself, the Sentry, will be using Swell, which is a pulsating wave of shadow damage happening 3 times. Of course, as you keep killing these corruptions, your stacks keep growing higher and higher, meaning you're taking more and more shadow damage from every AoE shadow damage application in this gauntlet. Of course, the trick here is to just pause for a second or two and let these disease stacks drop before continuing further. Unlike what we do in here, where we chain the corruption small mobs killed to the last 2 swells at the same time, and we engage them with 21 stacks of the disease, 210% more damage, and you can see the damage we are taking from that mechanic. So likely not advisable to be doing that once you're going through this gauntlet. Now, as we reach the last boss, one thing is worth mentioning when it comes to trash. At the moment, the trash count is a little bit undertuned in the sense that you are reaching the last boss, killing only what's in front of you, just going in a straight line. You are killing 107% of trash required, meaning that you would have to actually come up with ways to either mind soothe, skip, or invisibility skip in some way, which is also made difficult by the fact that one side of the trash mobs is a gauntlet, which you cannot skip. Another side is a corridor with the first boss in front of it, which won't disappear until you cleared all of the first corridor, so it makes the room for you to be able to skip mobs in this dungeon quite difficult, quite tricky, even though the trash count is at the moment too high for your normal press W and go forward path in the dungeon. Now, the last boss, the Ink of Ozumat First, has a pretty simple rotation of abilities, which can get, though, still quite messy in terms of room, in terms of space you have to play. The first thing he does is the Blotting Barrage, which will spawn 3 paddles on top of 3 players. The players themselves will take quite a decent amount of damage from that, but the important thing is the paddle left on the ground. Periodically, Neptulon, there to help you, will buff 2 players with Cleansing Flux, which is a 10-second long buff which allows you to clear the room of these paddles. So it's very important, everyone who gets targeted by Cleansing Flux, to run over the paddles and clear them. At the moment, stepping on these paddles does a lot of damage in this plus 20 key. It was doing 130,000 damage per tick. And also, the tick was basically instant. As soon as you stepped 1 foot on it, immediately you were taking damage, even when you were soaking the actual ability. Not only you were taking damage from the missile, but you were also taking instant damage from the first of you being in that pool that just spawned. The next mechanic, to make things more confusing and chaotic, is going to be the Deluge of Filth, which is going to be the boss spawning 4 adds. 2 melee adds and 2 caster adds that you just have to group together and AoE down. The tricky part is, of course, that as you go through the boss, more and more of the room will be filled with the paddles on the ground, as well as the boss itself will be casting Mark Spew, which is a cone frontal on the tank. As the room is getting smaller, you, as a DPS or a healer, finding room to stay not in front of the boss, to dodge this frontal from the tank, is going to be quite difficult. Also, sometimes interrupting the mobs far away, the caster mob that spawns right in the middle of the pools, making it much harder for melee specs to interrupt them, to force them to come to you. It will also be kind of an annoyance, and this cycle will repeat. He will cast Blotting Barrage on 3 players to spawn the pools, Neptulon will buff you to give you a chance to clear the pools, and then he will cast the add spawning mechanic while periodically using the frontal on the tank. This will repeat until you can kill him, which will then start the RP element, which has been kept in the last boss of this dungeon, which is you actually fighting Ozumat, which is mostly just for show. You're basically done killing the boss once you are defeating the Ink of Ozumat on the ground. The last part is basically just for show. That's how this dungeon is looking for now in Mythic Plus on the PTR. Of course, as mentioned, there are still quite a few details to be shaped out a bit, like some mobs being overtuned. The last boss's damage also was somewhat on the overtuned level, especially this one being a fortified key, not even tyrannical. The damage was still quite high for being at this level, but in terms of mechanics, I can already see some players being triggered by a few of them. The fixates of the Snapdragons, the healing absorb shield of the Sentinels will be quite an annoyance going through. So this is at least what we have in the first round, the first take of this dungeon when it comes to the updating of this old dungeon to have some more modern Mythic Plus mechanics. We will see as we continue going down through 10.2's PTR how many more changes we are going to be getting in Throne the Tides for the next season. But for now, this is all for today. We are now taking a break once more, starting with our goodbyes to all of the Patreon supporters, as well as everyone who is supporting for free. You can do so by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I was baited to bring on long sleeves for a couple of days, and we are back to having higher than satisfactory temperature over here.